Hey there, friend. Before we start, take a deep breath. Wiggle into your pillow like it's made of clouds. Dim the lights. Or better yet, imagine a candle flickering somewhere behind a wooden shutter, casting shadows on a stone wall. That's more on theme. Now, if you're new here, welcome to a place where history isn't about dates and wars, but weird habits, misunderstood traditions, and the bizarre reality of everyday life. And if you're a returning listener, welcome back to the slowest time machine in existence. If you enjoy these sleepy journeys through boring, but not really boring history, do hit like or subscribe, only if it feels right. And let me know in the comments, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I love knowing who's drifting off around the world with me. Tonight's episode is all about the private lives of medieval people. Not kings or queens, just regular folks. How they slept, ate, dressed, and tried not to freeze to death beside a goat. We'll peek into peasant huts, noble bedrooms, cramped inns, and icy monasteries. We'll sniff the strange smells, tiptoe past the snoring strangers, and meet the bedbugs who had better social lives than most humans. So pull up your imaginary feather bed, maybe hug a blanket close, and let's ease into the quiet, smelly, candlelit world of the Middle Ages. Starting, of course, with sleep. Because even 700 years ago, people were asking, why am I awake at 2 a.m.? Imagine it's 1342. You're a modest peasant, and your day has been the usual mix of backbreaking labor, pottage, and mild existential dread. The sun's gone down, the fire's dimmed, and the pigs are finally quiet. Time to sleep, right? Well, sort of. In the Middle Ages, sleep didn't come in one neat, uninterrupted package. People practiced something called segmented sleep, which sounds like a sleep app feature but was just a natural response to candlelit nights and drafty houses. Most folks would drift off shortly after sundown, entering first sleep, a deep, restorative snooze that lasted a few hours. Then, like clockwork, they'd wake up, around midnight. Not because of nightmares or noisy neighbors, but because that's just how sleep worked. They called it the watch, a waking interlude where people would read, pray, stoke the fire, check the livestock, or, yes, get frisky with their spouse. Doctors even recommended it. According to medieval science, your body was better suited to intimacy after the first sleep, calm of mind, warm of limb, too tired to argue. Romantic, in a slightly damp, flea-bitten sort of way. After this midnight hour or two, everyone would slip back into second sleep, a gentler rest that lasted until dawn. Even literary figures like Chaucer mentioned it casually, as though everyone knew the night was supposed to come in two parts. This wasn't considered a problem. In fact, waking up in the middle of the night was perfectly normal. Only later, thanks to factories, shift work, and those weird 19th century moralists who thought naps were sinful, did we start to believe sleep had to be 8 solid hours, no interruptions, or else something was wrong with us. So the next time you find yourself blinking at the ceiling at 2 a.m., don't panic, just whisper, "The watch has begun." Light a symbolic candle and pretend you have to go check on a medieval goat. All right, now that we've split the night into manageable chunks of consciousness, let's talk about where you'd actually be doing all this medieval tossing and turning. The bed. Calling it a bed might be generous. For most people in medieval Europe, your sleeping arrangement was what polite historians refer to as a straw pallet. Translation? A sack full of itchy, possibly damp, possibly moving hay, flattened under generations of exhausted bodies and an alarming number of insects. If you were lucky, the straw was relatively fresh and not already half composted. If you were really lucky, it was lifted slightly off the floor by a rickety wooden frame. And if you were extremely lucky, no mice that night. Linens. Ha! You probably slept in the same clothes you wore all day. Pajamas weren't a thing. And privacy definitely wasn't. Entire families, parents, children, maybe grandma, possibly the neighbor's visiting cousin, shared the same sleeping space, sometimes even the same straw pile. The idea was to stay warm and alive, not comfy and well-rested. If you rolled over and bumped into an elbow, a chicken, or someone else's lice colony, well, that was just part of the medieval bonding experience. Now, if you were a noble, things were a little cushier. Nobles had actual wooden beds, often with canopies, feather mattresses, and embroidered sheets. These were status symbols. People even inherited beds in their wills. Imagine passing down a mattress like a family heirloom. To my dearest nephew, I leave you great Aunt Matilda's slightly cursed goose-down bed. May it creak softly in your favor. But even noble beds weren't immune to medieval discomfort. No indoor plumbing, limited bathing, and a robust population of lice meant you might have the finest sheets in the kingdom and still wake up scratching. So yes, your medieval bed was a place to sleep, survive, possibly spoon a cousin for warmth, and wake up with a new flea friend named Roger. But it got the job done. Sort of. Today, when someone says they're having a nightcap, you probably picture a cozy little drink, something amber in a glass, sipped slowly by the fireplace while a jazz record plays somewhere off-screen. But in the Middle Ages, a nightcap wasn't a beverage. It was quite literally a hat, and not a glamorous one. Imagine this. It's winter. Your house has more drafts than windows. The fireplace has fizzled into embers, and your roof is one ill-placed gust away from becoming a bird nest. Naturally, your head gets cold. Solution? The medieval nightcap. These hats were long, pointed, and often ridiculous-looking. Think less Gatsby, more gnome cosplay. They were usually made of wool or linen, tied or tucked snugly around the scalp to trap what little heat your body could muster. Forget silk or satin. A medieval nightcap wasn't for style. It was defensive gear against hypothermia. Men wore them for warmth, women for modesty. Married women were often expected to cover their heads at all times. Yes, even while sleeping. A nightcap was modest, functional, and surprisingly political. Some even had embroidery to signal wealth or family status. Because nothing says noble bloodline like a hat you wear to bed that looks like it belongs in a puppet show. There were social rules too. If someone answered the door in their nightcap, it was a polite medieval way of saying, "I'm off duty, go away." No one expected coherent conversation from someone in bedtime headwear. These hats were often paired with nightshirts, long, loose tunics that hung awkwardly around the knees and looked like something a ghost would wear if it also paid taxes. Together, the nightcap and nightshirt formed a kind of early sleep uniform, slightly itchy, mildly embarrassing, and definitely not fire retardant. So next time you crawl into your memory foam bed wearing pajamas you picked out for softness and cuteness, pause for a moment. Picture yourself pulling on a pointy wool hat, rolling over onto a straw mattress, and hoping no one notices you've embroidered your initials in it. That, my friend, was bedtime fashion in the year 1320. Today, sharing a bed with someone you don't know is the kind of thing that happens in emergency shelters, overly enthusiastic hostels, or reality shows designed to end in lawsuits. But in the Middle Ages, it was standard operating procedure. Let's say you're a traveling merchant or a pilgrim on your way to see some holy toenail fragment. Maybe your ox cart broke down, or you lost your mule to a spirited tavern bet. Either way, it's getting dark and you need a place to sleep. You find an inn. Lucky you. But don't expect a private room or even your own bed. What you get is a spot in a bed. A shared bed with strangers. Possibly several of them. And no, there's no screen between you. No pillows either. Just you, your neighbor, and an unspoken agreement not to steal each other's boots. Inns in the medieval world were more like human bunkhouses. Privacy wasn't expected. If the bed had space, you were welcome to it. 2 to 4 people per bed was common. The only rule? Try not to be gross, though definitions of gross were flexible. Beds were sometimes assigned by trade. Blacksmiths with blacksmiths, monks with monks, thieves with, well, ideally with other thieves, to keep the treachery localized. But more often, it was first come, first sprawled. And women weren't always segregated from men. That's right, you might find yourself tucked in beside a widow from York and a traveling cheese merchant from Bruges, all breathing heavily in unison. Worried about theft? So was everyone. That's why travelers often tied their purses to their belts or slept with their heads on their baggage, turning a sack of turnips into both pillow and primitive alarm system. If your bag moved, you woke up. Or at least, you hoped you did. Of course, nobles didn't endure this indignity. They traveled with entourages, demanded private quarters, or simply camped outside in glorified tents the size of small villages. But for everyone else, sharing a bed with a stranger wasn't weird. It was practical, efficient, warm, and yes, occasionally itchy. So if you ever find yourself curled up in a soft bed, annoyed that your partner is hogging the duvet, just be glad it's only one person, and not 3 strangers, one with questionable hygiene, one with suspicious snoring patterns, and one who insists on humming in their sleep. We tend to think of bedtime as a peaceful thing, brushing your teeth, setting your alarm, maybe reading a chapter of something that's 50% plot, 50% marketing. Then you turn off the lights and drift into the abyss. But for people in the Middle Ages, bedtime was less winding down and more last rites but casual. Because in their world, every single night could be your last. Let's set the scene. You've spent the day toiling in the fields or whispering Latin in a damp monastery. You're itchy, cold, and about 60% breadcrumbs. The hearth is low, the shadows long, and the silence deep, minus the odd snore from Uncle Bernard or the cluck of a judgmental chicken. Now comes the most important ritual of the night, bedtime prayer. This wasn't optional. It wasn't decorative. It was existential insurance. People genuinely believed that falling asleep unconfessed might land your soul somewhere unpleasant. And medieval theology didn't have a middle ground. You were either on a fast track to paradise or eternally doomed. There was no snooze button for divine judgment. The standard bedtime prayer? You might recognize it. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Yes, that sweet little nursery rhyme? That's a medieval legal document disguised as a lullaby. It's basically saying, "Dear God, in case I die in the next 6 hours, please process my application quickly." And it wasn't just for kids. Adults had entire catalogs of prayers tailored to their specific anxieties. One for plague prevention, one for impure thoughts, one for dreams that featured goats in oddly human roles. Some even invoked specific saints, Michael for protection, Saint Anthony for restful dreams, and Saint Apollonia if your tooth hurt, which it probably did. If you were part of a religious order, this nightly ritual wasn't just personal. It was scheduled. Monks and nuns ended their day with compline, the final service in the canonical hours. They'd chant psalms in near darkness, bow deeply, and whisper farewell to the day, and, potentially, to the world. After compline, silence descended like a spiritual blanket. Talking was forbidden. You went to bed not with soft music or a sleep timer, but with the quiet dread that something, anything, could end you before dawn. Fire, illness, demons, or just being 31 in the 12th century. Even children were expected to pray. Parents told them that angels were watching while they slept, which sounds sweet, until you realize this was less about comfort and more about celestial surveillance. Heaven's baby monitor was always on. Theologians debated what dreams meant. Some said they were divine messages. Others feared they were demonic traps, temptations that could ruin your soul before breakfast. If you dreamt of stealing a loaf of bread, it wasn't dismissed as weird subconscious stuff. It was confession-worthy. You might wake up and immediately tell the priest about your imaginary baguette heist. Some people even tried to control their dreams by sleeping on their right side, saying specific verses, or avoiding certain foods. Onions were blamed for particularly rowdy nightmares. And let's not forget the superstitions. Hang a cross above your bed, sprinkle holy water at the door, tuck a relic under your pillow, assuming your cousin didn't sell it for beer money. Every night was a tiny battle between fear and faith, played out in hushed whispers in wooden beds. The irony? This elaborate bedtime ritual wasn't about rest. It was about being spiritually alert. Physically, you were half dead from the day. Mentally, you were preparing for judgment. So yes, bedtime in the medieval world was sacred, serious, and slightly terrifying. But it was also deeply human. People tried to find a sense of order in a world they couldn't control. Death came often and randomly. But prayer was something they could do, a final word, a final hope, and then, hopefully, second sleep. In the modern world, we treat dreams like late-night blooper reels. Maybe you were flying. Maybe you were late for an exam you haven't studied for in 12 years. Maybe a giant duck yelled at you in German. You wake up, laugh nervously, blame the cheese, and move on. But in the Middle Ages, dreams were serious business. To medieval minds, dreams weren't just leftover thoughts playing charades in your head. They were messages, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic, occasionally digestive. The trick was figuring out which, because if you dreamed the wrong thing and told the wrong person, you might end up in confession or in trouble. Let's start with the theology. According to medieval thinkers, monks, mystics, and the occasional opinionated bishop, your soul didn't exactly sleep when you did. Instead, it wandered. Which sounds poetic until you realize this meant your unconscious self could get into spiritual mischief. Sin didn't take naps. Neither did the devil. In fact, a bad dream might be interpreted as a literal attack from a demon, not a metaphor, not a suggestion. An actual invisible being popping into your REM cycle, like a morally questionable houseguest. So what counted as a bad dream? Oh, anything interesting, really. Flying, pride. Falling, punishment. Being chased, you're running from sin. Dreaming of a bear wearing a bishop's hat? That's either a deep prophetic vision or a sign you need to stop stealing pickled onions. The line between symbolic and sinful was blurry, and monks took notes, literally. Many monasteries kept dream journals, shared during morning meetings or private confessions. Some monks became famous for their visions. Others were quietly told to stick to bread and water before bed. Too much wine, and suddenly you're prophesying the fall of Constantinople because your goat looked at you funny. And speaking of goats, animals in dreams were huge. A lion meant courage, unless it bit you, in which case it meant God was mad. A snake was obvious. Temptation, evil, taxes. A dog could mean loyalty, protection, or uncleanliness, depending on whether it was barking, walking, or just staring at you judgmentally. Dream interpretation became its own genre. Entire books were written about it, filled with charts, diagrams, and enough theological hedging to make a lawyer cry. If thou dreameth of rain, it meaneth cleansing, unless the rain is sideways, in which case, wrath. It wasn't just monks. Nobles paid astrologers and spiritual advisors to interpret their dreams. A vision of a burning castle? You'd better double your guard. A dream about a fish speaking Latin? Probably time to go on pilgrimage. Meanwhile, peasants took dreams as signs, from God, from nature, or from that moldy bread they shouldn't have eaten. A mother dreaming of her child in danger might rush to a priest. A farmer dreaming of wolves might keep his sheep closer. A person dreaming of fire might check their thatched roof or blame their neighbor. Again, but it wasn't all gloom. Dreams could be positive. Seeing light, angels, or deceased loved ones was considered a blessing. And some saints were said to appear in dreams to offer advice or protection, like divine sleep consultants. Still, no one took them lightly. If you dreamed something unsettling, you confessed it. If it persisted, you fasted. If it got really weird, say 3 nights in a row of speaking in tongues while floating, someone might suggest an exorcism, or at least less garlic. Even literature leaned into this. Medieval stories often used dream sequences as plot devices. Knights dreaming of holy quests, queens dreaming of betrayal, peasants dreaming of money and waking up to more turnips. Dreams were the medieval Netflix, dramatic, allegorical, and rarely satisfying. The church walked a careful line. Dreams could be holy, yes, but they could also be traps. So best to be cautious, prayerful, and always assume your subconscious was up to something. And in a way, dreams were one of the few places where even the poorest could experience drama. No land, no power, doesn't matter. In your dreams, you could meet angels, battle dragons, speak with saints, or invent indoor plumbing. Then you'd wake up and step barefoot into a chicken. Let's say you're tucking yourself into your medieval bed for the night, pulling the wool blanket up to your chin, nestling into your straw pile. And then, without ceremony, a chicken hops onto your legs. Normal? In the Middle Ages? Very. Because when it came to sleeping arrangements, medieval folks had one rule: bring the animals inside. We might raise our eyebrows today at the thought of livestock in the living room, but back then, it wasn't just practical, it was essential. Animals were warm, valuable, and sometimes better company than your cousin who snored like a dying bagpipe. The average medieval home was a single room. One. No bedrooms. No living room, no upstairs yoga studio, just 4 walls, a leaky roof, and a floor that occasionally remembered to be dirt. And in this space lived everyone, the family, the children, and the entire supporting cast of the barnyard. Cows in the corner, chickens underfoot, a pig near the hearth. This wasn't an accident. It was central heating, medieval edition. You see, houses were cold, not put on a sweater cold. Is my breath freezing indoors cold? The thatched roofs leaked. The stone walls sweated. The wind came in through gaps so large they had names. And fireplaces, charming as they are in fairy tales, didn't heat much. In fact, in many peasant homes, there was no chimney, just a fire pit in the center of the room, smoke spiraling up and out through a hole in the roof. If the wind shifted, congrats, you're now a smoked ham. So animals weren't just tolerated inside, they were invited. A pig could raise the room temperature, a cow even more. Dogs curled up at feet, chickens fluffed against calves, cats, assuming they were in the mood, might settle in your lap. Everyone contributed body heat, and no one had the energy to complain. At least, not out loud. Did it smell? Yes. Did it scratch? Often. Did it snore, squawk, or attempt to lay an egg on your face at dawn? Absolutely. But it was better than freezing. And it wasn't just warmth. Animals were valuable. A pig was your investment portfolio. A chicken was breakfast on legs. A cow. That was wealth with udders. Keeping them close at night meant they were safer from thieves, wolves, or that suspicious neighbor who always asked too many questions about your goat. This cozy arrangement was especially common among peasants. Nobles, of course, had options. They slept in separate chambers, occasionally with lapdogs for style rather than warmth. Some even built small stables attached to their chambers so they could hear their horses at night. Call it early medieval ASMR. But for everyone else, it was one big cuddle pile. Equal parts family, livestock, and germs. Of course, this led to some logistical issues. There were accidents. You could get kicked in the shin by a startled cow. You might step barefoot into a warm gift from the pig. You could lose your bedding to a rooster with boundary issues. And don't even ask what happens when the goose decides 3 a.m. is the perfect time to honk at Satan. Still, no one questioned it. This was life. You slept with the creatures that fed you, warmed you, and occasionally stepped on your face. It wasn't weird. It was Wednesday. Even city dwellers had pets and animals nearby. Pigeons roosted in attics. Cats chased rats in kitchens. Dogs patrolled courtyards. It wasn't uncommon to hear a donkey braying 2 floors below while you tried to fall asleep to the soothing sounds of domestic chaos. So if you've ever slept next to a dog that stole the blankets or a cat who sat on your face at 4 a.m., congratulations. You're participating in an ancient tradition. Medieval folks would have understood completely. They just would have added a pig, and possibly a duck. Let's step now into the other end of the medieval sleep spectrum. No straw piles, no pigs, no toddlers using your leg as a foot warmer. Just silence, prayer, and one of the most aggressively uncomfortable sleeping arrangements in history. Welcome to the medieval monastery, where luxury went to die, and comfort was considered a gateway to sin. If you're picturing monks reclining on embroidered pillows after a day of quiet reflection and herb gardening, think again. The daily life of a monk was strict, monotonous, and organized down to the minute, including the time you were allowed to sleep and how uncomfortably you had to do it. Your bed? Likely a wooden board. If you were lucky, a thin straw mat or a blanket was added. If you were really lucky, it wasn't infested with lice from Brother Peter's overly pious hair shirt. And privacy? Forget it. Most monasteries followed a dormitory model, a large, open hall filled with rows of identical sleeping places. Picture a room of 40 men lying perfectly still on wood, fully clothed, fully silent, under the same rule. No talking, no shifting, no dreaming too loudly. Because dreams? Suspicious. Comfort? A trap. Snoring? A gray area. But God is watching. All of this stemmed from a foundational idea in medieval monastic life. The body must be denied so the soul can rise. Sleep, in this logic, wasn't a right. It was a necessity barely tolerated by the church. Many monks slept fully dressed, in their robes, belts, sometimes even their sandals. Not for modesty, but to avoid any risk of indulgence or wasted time putting clothes on for night prayers. And yes, night prayers were a thing. Every night, around 2 a.m., the bells would toll, summoning the entire community to the chapel for matins, the first prayer of the day. In the dark, half asleep and possibly drooling slightly, monks would shuffle into the cold chapel and chant psalms in unison. Then, depending on the order, they might go back to bed or go straight into study or chores. Some monastic orders made this even stricter. The Carthusians, for example, were known to sleep in a seated position, leaning against wooden boards. Why? Because lying flat was considered dangerously close to pleasure. Sleep was meant to remind you of death, not resemble it. And monks didn't just follow this for spiritual brownie points. It was built into the architecture. Some monasteries had raised stone platforms instead of beds, and others avoided windows in sleeping quarters to ensure darkness, complete, unyielding, absolute. After all, light might reveal temptation. A breeze might feel nice. That's not the goal. Even the idea of having a pillow was debated. Some abbots banned them. Others allowed one, but only if it was lumpy enough to prevent dreams. You could almost hear the bedtime prayer. Lord, bless this slightly painful lump beneath my neck. May it keep me on the righteous path and away from thinking about cheese. Of course, not all monks were perfect. Some were caught napping through matins. Others snuck in extra padding or even dared to gasp sleep lying down. These lapses were treated with the same seriousness modern workplaces reserve for embezzlement. Punishments varied, but usually included more prayers, skipped meals, or humiliating public apologies. Forgive me, brethren, I accidentally experienced mild comfort. And yet, in this grim sleep landscape, there was a strange kind of peace. Monks believed their suffering was meaningful. Denying comfort was part of the spiritual discipline. Every cold floor, every echoing snore, every splintery nap on a hardwood slab was an offering to God. Still, let's be honest, compared to the family straw pile next to a flatulent pig, the monastery dormitory wasn't that much worse, just quieter and holier, and somehow more exhausting, despite being less crowded. So tonight, when you stretch out under your cozy blanket, perhaps light a candle and fluff your pillow just so, spare a thought for those who slept in silence, on wood, with their arms folded like a saint's statue, whispering psalms instead of counting sheep. They weren't trying to get comfortable, they were trying to get into heaven. Let's talk about the real villain of medieval bedtime. Not demons, not fleas, not your cousin's terrible snoring. The real enemy was the temperature. Because no matter the season, the medieval bedroom was never the right temperature. It was always either too cold, too hot, or somehow both, often within the same night. And medieval people, lacking central heating or air conditioning, or any kind of conditioning, really, just had to deal with it. Let's start with winter. Now, when we say cold, we don't mean turn up the thermostat cold. We mean numb your soul cold. Think, frost on the inside of the walls. Think, your breath misting above you while you're under 3 layers of damp wool, praying your toes survive until morning. Medieval homes were not designed with comfort in mind. Peasant cottages had dirt floors, drafty thatched roofs, and walls made of wattle and daub, which is basically medieval for twigs and mud with optimism. Insulation was not a concept. It was a future luxury nobody could imagine because they were too busy being frozen solid. Windows? Maybe. But if they existed, they were usually just open holes covered with oiled parchment or thin animal horn. These kept out exactly 0 wind. If you were wealthy enough to have actual glass, congratulations. You lived in a drafty castle instead, where the wind echoed like a vengeful ghost through the stone corridors. The hearth fire helped, but only a little. It warmed the immediate area, but by bedtime, it was a pile of coals. And forget closing the door to trap heat. Many peasants didn't even have doors, just cloth hangings or wooden slabs that creaked dramatically every time the wind coughed. So how did people sleep? They bundled. In every sense, families shared beds to pool body heat. Layers of wool, fur, and whatever else was lying around were piled on top. People slept in their clothes, in their boots sometimes. Nightcaps weren't a cute accessory. They were survival gear. And if you had an animal nearby, you let it cuddle close. Because that pig? It was the only source of warmth that didn't snore in Latin. But then, there was summer. Ah, summer. The time when everything was supposed to be better. Right? Wrong. Because without insulation, stone walls turned homes into medieval ovens. The sun baked the thatch, heated the air, and turned enclosed spaces into sweat lodges for the spiritually confused. There was no breeze, no fans, no refreshing iced tea. Just heat, humidity, and layers of wool clothing no one dared remove for fear of scandal and sunburn. Even at night, the heat lingered. Bodies packed together in a small room, animals breathing heavily in the corner, a fire still smoldering in the hearth. It all added up to a thick, cloying warmth that clung to the skin like guilt. And you couldn't just sleep in the nude. Medieval society had rules. Modesty was spiritual armor. Plus, if you were caught unclothed during a fire, an invasion, or the second coming, which many people believed could happen any night, you didn't want to be the person explaining why you met your maker pantsless. So you endured. You scratched. You shifted. You stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the wood and wondering if this much sweat was holy. Then there was rain. Oh, the rain. A leaky roof meant water dripping directly onto your face at 3 a.m. If your house was near a river or built in a marshy area, as many were, your floor might slowly transform into a mud pit. Ever wake up with a damp sock and a confused frog? That's the medieval experience. And yet, sleep went on. Because it had to. There were no other options. People got used to it. They adapted. They slept curled up or flat out or sitting against the wall. They used the heat of animals, the insulation of straw, the shield of a good prayer, and the unbreakable human talent for finding rest in even the most ridiculous circumstances. So the next time you're lying awake, annoyed that your blanket is too warm or your pillow is too cold, just remember, medieval people slept through cold that could kill, heat that could melt, and drafts that sounded like wolves whispering Latin. And they still woke up the next day, probably stiff, slightly damp and grumpy, but alive, mostly. Today, sleeping alone is framed as a luxury, a quiet bed. A pillow all to yourself, no one stealing the covers, no one breathing hot air onto your neck at 3 a.m. It's peaceful, independent, empowering. In the Middle Ages, it was weird. Suspicious even. Sleeping alone, especially at night, wasn't just unusual. It was considered unsafe, impractical, and morally questionable. Because nighttime wasn't just a time for rest. It was a time when your soul could be attacked, your body could be tempted, and your dreams could invite uninvited guests, both spiritual and human. Let's start with the basics. Warmth. We've already talked about how freezing medieval houses were in winter, and how central heating was often just your cousin's body heat. Sharing a bed, whether with family, servants, strangers, or a pet pig, wasn't just economical. It was necessary. You slept close because that's how you stayed warm. There were no heated blankets, no flannel pajamas. Number 24-hour medieval HVAC guy. So to choose to sleep alone? That raised questions. Even for the wealthy, who could technically afford separate rooms and beds, solitude was rare. Married couples almost always slept in the same bed, sometimes joined by their children, a wet nurse, or the odd visiting niece. Privacy was a myth. If you had enough money to sleep alone, and still chose to, people wondered what you were up to. Then there was spiritual fear. You see, night wasn't just physically dark. It was morally dangerous. The church warned that nighttime was when the devil did his best work, whispering temptation into your dreams, planting sins in your imagination, or sending demons to sit on your chest, which medieval people genuinely believed was the cause of night terrors. Sleeping alone meant there were no witnesses if something went wrong. If you had a sinful dream, or woke up from a fit, or were found muttering to yourself under the covers, well, that was deeply concerning. At best, you were eccentric. At worst, you were possessed. In fact, many people believed that being alone made you more vulnerable to demonic attacks. With no one to watch over you, protect you, or wake you up from an unholy vision, your soul was essentially unguarded. You were spiritually exposed. Like leaving your medieval house unlocked with a sign that said, "Dear demons, come on in." Even children were never expected to sleep solo. Not for years. They curled up with parents, siblings, or other children. Being alone at night was something that only happened to orphans, hermits, or punished monks. That's right, some monastic orders actually used solitary sleeping as a form of punishment, not because it was peaceful, but because it was terrifying. If Brother Ambrose broke his vow of silence, or got a little too enthusiastic at dinner, he might be ordered to sleep alone in the side chamber. No candle, no company, and plenty of opportunities to think about his sins. And then there were the stories. Folklore was full of warnings about what happened to people who slept alone. Spirits were said to target the isolated. Witches might sneak in through cracks in the walls. Fairies could steal your breath. Ghosts might visit, especially if you'd failed to settle your debts or offended the wrong sheep. Even practical concerns made solitary sleep unlikely. If you had a seizure, or fell ill, or died in your sleep, there'd be no one to help, or even notice. In a world where medicine was a toss-up and bedbugs were sentient, having someone next to you wasn't just company, it was a first line of defense. So what did this mean in practice? It meant that even in noble homes, even in castles with enough bedrooms to house a football team, people often bunked together. Servants might sleep in the same room or even on the floor, beside their lords. Visiting guests expected to share a bed with their host. Traveling strangers curled up in crowded inns with no concept of personal space, and no one found it strange. Because being alone in the dark wasn't seen as peaceful. It was unnatural, cold, exposing, the domain of hermits, holy saints, or people on the run. So the next time you stretch out across your mattress, enjoying the sweet solitary silence, remember, in medieval Europe, that would have made you the most mysterious person in the village. Best case, people thought you were deeply spiritual. Worst case, they sent a priest, just in case. If you've ever fallen asleep in a car, on a plane, or during a particularly boring Zoom call, you probably woke up with a stiff neck, a confused sense of time, and the quiet shame of drooling on your own chest. But in the Middle Ages, that upright nap might have been considered a solid lifestyle choice, because yes, some medieval folks deliberately slept sitting up. And not just once or twice after too much cider. For certain people, sleeping semi-upright wasn't an accident. It was a health practice, a spiritual exercise, and, occasionally, an over-the-top show of virtue. Let's start with the medical reasoning, which, as always in medieval times, was equal parts fascinating and deeply questionable. According to the medical texts of the era, written by men who believed sneezing could realign your soul, lying completely flat was bad for you. Why? Because it was thought to encourage the dangerous pooling of humors, the bodily fluids that controlled everything, from digestion to mood, to whether you looked like you'd angered a minor saint. If you slept flat, the theory went, phlegm could rise and clog the brain, or bile could slosh into the wrong organ, or vapors might drift down into your lungs, whatever that meant. You were basically a soup, and horizontal sleep just stirred the pot in all the wrong ways. So the solution? Sleep propped up, supported by a pile of bolsters, cushions, or even a carved wooden headboard. It was believed this position helped prevent everything from nightmares to indigestion to spontaneous death by gas. And for those with chronic illnesses, this method made sense. People with respiratory issues, toothaches, or digestive problems were often told to stay upright in bed to prevent vapors from rising. It's unclear how effective this was, but at least it gave them something to focus on between plagues. Then came the spiritual reasons. Sleeping too comfortably was seen as suspicious. The idea was that comfort led to dreams, and dreams could lead to sin. You might dream about food, or dancing, or your neighbor's suspiciously muscular son. That was a problem, especially for monks and nuns, who were in the business of avoiding sin even in their sleep. Some monastic orders took this to extremes. Sleeping upright wasn't just a health measure, it was a spiritual challenge. Certain monks would lean against walls, rest on narrow wooden benches, or even sleep while kneeling. their arms crossed over their chests like repentant gargoyles. It wasn't about rest, it was about denial. Denying the flesh, denying the pillow, denying the very concept of dreams. Because if you were uncomfortable enough, surely God would notice. Of course, some of this was performative. There were always a few monks who wanted everyone to know just how holy they were. "Oh, Brother Ambrose needs a feather pillow? That's cute. I sleep on cold stone and meditate through the pain. Praise be." But upright sleeping wasn't just limited to religious zealots. Some nobles also adopted it, especially in later medieval periods. Their beds were often constructed with built-in supports, allowing them to recline at a dignified angle, as if always ready for a surprise portrait. In fact, the noble deathbed portrait, where someone is shown propped up in a grand bed, pale and tragic, wasn't just artistic license. Many people did spend their final nights upright, surrounded by family, servants, and at least one very nervous priest. There were even bed designs that accommodated the trend. Some were angled slightly upward, others had raised headboards. Some featured pillows so large they resembled small livestock. Comfort wasn't the goal, virtue was. Still, not everyone could afford this kind of piety. Most peasants, after a day of working themselves into the dirt, slept however they could, flat, curled up, or folded into whatever shape their straw mattress allowed. Upright sleeping required space, props, and the kind of social status that let you tell people, "No, this is supposed to hurt." But even among common folk, the idea persisted. Too much comfort was risky. If you slept too well, you might not wake up. And if you died in your sleep, flat on your back, in the posture of the dead, well, you might confuse your guardian angel, who could show up early and assume the worst. So next time you adjust your pillow to the perfect height, or lie back with that satisfying sigh, remember, there were once people who refused to recline, just in case their dreams invited temptation, or their bile took a wrong turn. They suffered through the night, not for sleep, but for salvation, and perhaps a little spiritual one-upmanship. Let's take a moment to acknowledge the real stars of medieval bedtime. Not the monks, not the nightcaps, not even the pigs snuggling up by the hearth. No, the true rulers of the night were tiny, relentless, six-legged terrorists. The kind that didn't care about your social class, your sleeping posture, or how many prayers you muttered before bed. We're talking about fleas, lice, bedbugs, and their unsung companion, the itch that launched 1,000 medieval complaints. Because no matter who you were, peasant, priest, princess, you were never truly alone in bed. Let's begin with lice, the humble, head-hugging parasite. In the Middle Ages, lice were so common that they barely registered as a problem. People accepted them as just part of the human condition, like taxes, or church bells, or that strange smell coming from Brother Edmund. Most medieval folk were never completely free of lice. The creatures nested in hair, eyebrows, clothing seams, and bedding. People would casually pick them off each other while chatting. There were even jokes about it, because if you couldn't laugh at your own infestations, you'd probably cry and throw yourself into a suspiciously cold river. If you were lucky enough to spot them early, you might use a lice comb, a small, fine-toothed tool not unlike the ones used today. But combs weren't always effective, and bathing regularly was a luxury few could afford. Most people just made peace with the scratching. Then came fleas, the jumping menaces of medieval life. Fleas loved straw beds, wool blankets, and anything warm and vaguely mammalian, which was everything. They traveled on humans, dogs, cats, livestock, and sometimes even rats, though not nearly as often as pop history would like to think. Once they got into your bed, they stayed. And remember, these weren't just annoying. Fleas were also potential disease vectors, though medieval people didn't know it. They just knew that scratching led to sores, Sores led to infections, and infections led to, "Oops, I've died." Flea prevention strategies ranged from burning herbs around the bed to placing lavender or rosemary in the mattress. Some even believed that onions under the pillow could ward them off, which probably just annoyed the fleas and everyone within sniffing distance. And then there were bedbugs. Yes, even in the 14th century, these tiny vampires haunted the corners of medieval beds. Unlike lice and fleas, which were more mobile, bed bugs settled in the wooden cracks of bed frames and the seams of cloth, emerging only at night to nibble on unsuspecting sleepers. The worst part, they were sneaky. You often didn't know you had bed bugs until you woke up covered in bites, grumpy, and plotting your next move with a medieval mix of herbs, desperation, and spiritual panic. Some people attempted to smoke them out, literally. Burning bundles of dried plants like wormwood, mint, or bay leaves beneath the bed was thought to drive pests away. The logic was, if you can't kill them, at least annoy them enough to move next door. But did it work? Not really. Infestations were rampant. And while the very rich might change their sheets more often, or simply burn the mattress and buy a new one, most folks had to live with the reality that their bed was not entirely their own. Even the church got involved. Monks occasionally included anti-vermin prayers in their nightly routines, as though divine intervention might finally smite the itch. Spoiler, it usually didn't. Now, you might think this was a lower-class problem, but no. Everyone dealt with these creatures. Kings scratched. Queens scratched. Even saints scratched. There are entire letters and diaries from nobles complaining about sleepless nights, biting pests, and how their servants weren't cleaning properly. One 15th century writer described his stay at a well-appointed inn as splendid, except for the biting bed and the snoring priest. Which, honestly, still sounds like a 3-star review. And the worst part? People just accepted it. It was normal, expected, something you sighed about and worked around. You tucked your robe tighter, kept your comb nearby, and tried not to scream when something crawled across your ankle at 2 a.m. So the next time your sheets feel a bit scratchy, or your pillow's too flat, remember, at least it's not full of insects. Probably. If it is, well, congratulations. You've recreated the full medieval experience, minus the pig. After a night of itchy beds, shivering drafts, mysterious sounds, and possibly a goose sleeping on your chest, morning came to the medieval household like an awkward guest. Uninvited, loud, and way too early. There was no snooze button, no gentle wake-up light, no curated lo-fi playlist easing you into consciousness. Waking up in the Middle Ages was a cold, abrupt, often noisy affair. Let's begin with timing. Most medieval folks rose with the sun, or even before it. Artificial light was a luxury, so the day was structured around natural light. If you wanted to get anything done, you needed to start early, especially if you were a peasant. Fields weren't going to plow themselves. Cows were already mooing. And someone had to reheat the leftover porridge from yesterday, now congealed into something resembling oat brick. But rising early wasn't just practical. It was also moral. The church preached the virtues of waking up before dawn. Sloth, one of the deadly sins, had a close cousin, sleeping in. Being slow to rise was a sign of laziness, weakness, or worse, decadence. In monasteries, bells rang well before sunrise to call monks to prayer. No excuses. No hiding under the blanket. God, it was believed, was watching, and he did not approve of oversleeping. So how did people actually wake up? For many, it was a natural process. Your internal clock, honed by years of routine, nudging you into consciousness the moment a rooster crowed or the sun hit your face through a badly patched roof. But in cities, there were additional noises, carts clattering, bells ringing, bakers starting their ovens, fishmongers yelling about eels at ungodly hours. Medieval mornings were not quiet, and in monasteries, the wake-up call came in the form of a bell, rung with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't slept either. Sometimes a designated monk would even walk through the dormitory, calling the brothers to rise for lauds or prime, the early prayer services. Imagine being jolted awake every day by someone chanting Latin near your face. Spiritually motivating? Maybe. Emotionally scarring? Absolutely. What followed was a groggy shuffle into the morning routine. For peasants, this meant stoking the hearth, feeding the animals, milking cows, sweeping the floor, and reheating yesterday's bread, or just gnawing it cold. For nobles, it meant being assisted out of bed by servants, though even they didn't lounge long. A nobleman was expected to attend to affairs, meet with stewards, or ride off dramatically at least once a week. But before anything else, before breakfast or even socks, if you had socks, came prayer. A quick thank you to God for not dying in your sleep was customary. It was considered good spiritual hygiene. You'd stretch, yawn, scratch, probably, and whisper a morning blessing. Some people even kept a small cross by the bed for this very purpose, an anchor between sleep and wakefulness, between the perils of night and the chaos of day. Then came the bed tidy up, if you could call it that. Peasants rarely had extra bedding. You just smoothed the straw, maybe fluffed it, maybe turned it if it was too damp or if something small had died in it. Nobles had actual linens and might have servants restuff the mattress, replace sheets, or air out the bedding, especially if it had acquired mysterious medieval odors, which it always had. Some monastic rules even specified how you had to make your bed, neatly, with humility, and without unnecessary fluffing. One order required beds to be made so quickly and quietly that no sound but the sigh of the straw may be heard. Then came food, if you were lucky. Most people broke their fast with simple fare: bread, ale, maybe cheese. In monasteries, breakfast was often skipped entirely, as fasting was a spiritual virtue. For peasants, breakfast was practical, something to carry them through hours of manual labor. But even that meal was done quickly, without much ceremony. You ate what you had and moved on. Still groggy? Too bad. Sleepiness was a sin. You were up, you were working, you were morally and physically upright. Unless you were sick, dying, or an extremely elderly bishop, there were no excuses. And what if you didn't wake up? Well, that was taken very seriously. A family member who failed to rise could be gently shaken, or not so gently. People were afraid of death in sleep, especially if the person hadn't said their nightly prayers. If someone didn't stir, someone else ran to get the priest, just in case. You didn't want your soul to drift too far before breakfast. But most days, you rose as usual. Tired, slightly sore, possibly itching, but alive. You threw off your smelly blanket, greeted your snoring cousin, avoided stepping on a chicken, and stepped into the rising day, ready to survive, sweat, and eventually do it all again. So if you ever feel annoyed by your alarm clock, your stiff back, or the way your cat insists on walking across your face at 6 a.m., just remember, you could be waking up in a pile of hay, surrounded by fleas, with a monk chanting in your face. And no coffee. And so, dear listener, we've wandered through the shadowy hallways of medieval sleep. We've huddled together in overcrowded beds, murmured prayers against the creeping dark, and scratched at invisible invaders in the straw. We've woken to roosters, bells, and breezes that smelled faintly of damp sheep. We've learned that a good night's sleep wasn't guaranteed, but it was always attempted, with courage, superstition, and, occasionally, a live pig under the covers. What's most striking isn't just how differently they slept, but how human it all still feels. They feared the night, but also found comfort in its rhythms. They shared their beds, their dreams, and their itches. They invented bedtime rituals not unlike our own. Stories told aloud, prayers whispered in the dark, the hopeful fluffing of a very underwhelming pillow. Yes, medieval sleep was chaotic, crowded, often cold, sometimes spiritually dramatic, but it was also deeply communal, profoundly habitual, and stitched into the rhythms of life in a way we might envy today. They didn't have blackout curtains, but they had second sleep. They didn't have melatonin gummies, but they had psalms and porridge. They didn't have silence, but they had each other. So as you drift off tonight, alone, under a clean blanket, on a pillow that, hopefully, doesn't contain insects, spare a thought for the long line of dreamers who came before you, who slept sitting up, or lying in hay, or listening for angels, or bandits, just outside the door. May your night be warmer than theirs, quieter than theirs, and ever so slightly less itchy. Sleep well, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment about whether you'd rather share a medieval bed with a nobleman or a chicken.